For those of you that have watched the other podcasts, you may recognize the man to my left. This is Gary Klein, who is back by popular demand because, Gary, what did we talk about the first time?
Cluster bees.
Okay, now, if you don't know what cluster bees are, I would highly recommend that you watch our first meeting with Gary. And as you can see, we've upgraded our facilities a bit here and hope that you also have better sound. We believe you will. But even if you don't, or if you have not seen the first one, let's just briefly talk about cluster B personality types, and then we're going to talk about, we're only going to touch on that briefly because that's what the first podcast was about, and a little bit about what an experience with a cluster B personality is. But today we're going to be speaking about how you can cope with and deal better with, and is there hope for cluster B personality folks? Is that right? So briefly, let's talk about, for the people that didn't have the benefit of seeing podcast number 1, what is a cluster B personality and why should that concern people that are dealing with a divorce or a split?
Okay. There's borderline, antisocial, histrionic, and narcissistic. If you just think about this big umbrella and it's narcissism, it just shows up a little differently and they're all kind of mixed up together. These folks are predatory and they will consume you.
But I love her. I mean, you're not just saying I should abandon her or him or whoever it might be.
No, what I'm suggesting is learning about the different personality types so that people can know what they're dealing with. Because we think we're talking about this up here, where have you been, can you pick up dinner tonight? And they're operating from down here on the psychological level, and it's always about manipulation, it's always about control, it's always about domination.
Well, that's because my wife, my girlfriend, was abused. And if I just show a lot of love and compassion and patience, it may take years, Gary, but eventually I will overcome, right?
Well, hopefully, if you believe in reincarnation, it may take a few lifetimes.
That's so cynical, Gary.
Yeah, it's reality.
How can you say that?
Because it's reality. It just is. It's unfortunate, but it just is.
Now, let me make sure. In other words, what we're saying here is you can have hope. You can believe and be very optimistic, but that's not going to change a cluster B person.
Correct.
And cluster B people are not a matter of, I'm trying to think, it's not like toilet training a child. Yes, untrained, a child may or may not ever be able to control their bowels.
Right.
And then what you tell them is, hey, don't poop in your pants. There's actually a better way to do that. You can actually hold it till you get to a restroom. They're like, oh, it never occurred to me before. I've never been told this was inappropriate. In fact, people were accommodating me. I was wearing a diaper and everything else. But now I'm being told that's not appropriate. I've got to wear this fabric underwear, and if I poop my pants, everybody's miserable, including me. But I actually do find out that I can learn to visit the restroom, and I can control myself. And then as you get to be an adult, you come to understand, oh, well, this makes all the sense in the world. But as a kid, you don't even realize that you're learning how to do that.
Right.
Okay. Cluster B people, can they be toilet trained out of being cluster B?
I've heard stories. I've never seen one.
Right.
I've never seen one.
So what we're talking about is this isn't like alcoholism, where somebody can say, hi, my name is Eric, and I'm a cluster B personality.
Right.
And hi, Eric. And then we can learn how to cope. Now, there is hope for curing cluster B, right? It has been known to either been cured or managed.
Right, yes.
But the odds are, and this is what I've heard, now you tell me, it's easier to cure a heroin addiction than it is to overcome a cluster B.
Yeah, I've never heard that, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So see, what we're telling you here is if you're dealing with a cluster B personality type, you can't win. The odds are, you have a better chance of getting struck by lightning than learning how to get along with a cluster B personality without wanting to blow your own brains out. Okay? Have we made it clear enough to you? Now, I know, and I'm sure you know even better, a lot of you hearing this are saying, oh, you know what? That speaks to me, but I'm the exception. No, you're just a fool. And so if you can accept that, there is hope. Is there not, Gary?
Yeah.
Okay, because then there's change. And what will the change be? In you.
Right.
By casting off your cluster B personality significant other. Or laying down ground rules you can live with.
Right.
So before we go any further and talk about how we can cope with cluster B personality types, whether that mean learning to live with them or simply getting up the courage and the good sense to throw them out, talk a little bit about how the cluster B mind works.
Okay. There was a video I saw, alligator theme park in Florida. The alligators, they keep their mouths open because their bodies, they don't have pores, so that's their air conditioning. So
More surface area, and it just keeps them cool that way.
It keeps them cool. Yeah, they're not threatening, they're not attacking. This is just air conditioning. And so an employee who worked there, he would put his head inside the jaws and wow the crowd. So he took a towel and he wiped his face like that, and he put his head inside the jaw again. And this time the alligator went wham and just bit the guy's head. So they went back and they showed on the video, when he wiped his face, he got all of it, but one little drop of perspiration, that hit the tongue, stimulus, response, boom. So the alligators don't say, okay, is this something I want? Is this not something I want? It's just stimulus and response. And that's the same way that I see with cluster Bs. Anytime they feel that they're not on top, and to them, to a cluster B, if you're down here and they're here, this is equal. So anytime you try to have an adult-to-adult relationship with them, that's the stimulus, and the response is boom. They've got to get you back down there and keep you off balance. And they do that. It's always chaos.
Sound familiar? We know, because Gary's first podcast was so popular, that many of you we know are like, I get it. That's me. I thought I had the problem. Many of you do, but many of you don't, and it isn't your problem. And we're going to tell you about how to deal with that now. So let me ask you a few questions. Other than what we've talked about, what are the signs of somebody with a cluster B personality type?
Okay. What happens is we get into relationships, and in retrospect, you look back and go, oh, those are really big red flags, but we're in love and all of that stuff, and we really don't recognize it. There'll be little things, inconsistencies. Well, no, wait a minute, you said you'd be here. No, I never said that. And so a lot of defensiveness, and they're not trying to say, well, let's put our heads together and come to a nice solution. If they're always being right, they always have to be right, and that's really common. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. Even if it's done with a smile, like a benevolent narcissist, it's always about the control and the domination.
Do they feed off of people that are taught to be kind of to live a Judeo-Christian ethic?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know what I mean? Oh, hey, you're upset with me, but I'll, for the sake of getting along, I'm actually a virtuous person by just not taking you to task.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that you'll reward me later by being patient with me and apologetic?
No, not at all. Not at all. It's you'll go and do something nice, and they'll go, "Oh, thank you very much. What else? What else can you do for me?" So it really doesn't count.
Yeah.
And so there's no reciprocity, and it's not an adult-to-adult relationship.
Okay.
It's parent to child, or then they flip down into the child role. You hurt me, you're mean to me, and it's almost never this. And if it is, it's very short-lived, or it's just a ruse to get something else.
But you know, we've all been in situations where we got off on the wrong foot, and if I just spent extra effort to show an increase of love and kindness, boy, that pays dividends.
Yeah, you're toast. You're just absolute
Well,
toast.
no, I'm talking about, but I mean, I didn't get along with a coworker, and so one day I brought the coworker, some fresh baked banana bread, or just on a whim said, hey, why don't we go get some lunch? My treat. I mean, that surely a cluster B person will be touched in their heart.
Okay,
In
so
some way, if I'm a nice guy, if she's a nice gal, that's going to crack through that cluster B shell, right?
Okay, so before when we talked about reptiles and mammals are nice people who want to have an adult-to-adult relationship. If you're dealing with a mammal, absolutely, because then the other person will say, thank you very much, let's smooth this over, and then we're back to adult-to-adult. With the cluster Bs, the reptiles, they'll take that as, you're lowering yourself because you want to get in my good graces. Great, you're going to be easier to manipulate next time. And it's always like that. So the more you do, the weaker you look to them.
Even
and
though
attack.
you don't feel weak,
Right.
even though you aren't weak, even though you don't want to be perceived as weak.
Right.
And they can't see that. You could even say, now don't think that I'm doing this out of weakness. Does that even register?
No.
Yeah.
No, it's just...
Okay. So I now realize, okay, I'm in a cluster B kind of situation. I'm willing to at least give Gary and Eric the benefit of the doubt. But I still feel something for this significant other of mine. How about some therapy or some counseling? Now, I'm not saying that with tongue in cheek. Therapy, I used to have a bad opinion of therapy and counseling myself. And it has mellowed over time, and I can see it can really do some good. Not in all situations, but it can. Now, how about cluster B? Can you tell somebody, I think you're a narcissist, or might be, or can you say, it's my fault, but I want us to go? Can you approach them and convince them to go to counseling? Will it just be another one of those, a way to manipulate and master that person, or can therapy have a beneficial effect?
Okay, so this is what I see. A man, woman will come in, and the couple agrees that they need some counseling, but the way it usually works is the person who's at home says, no, you go get fixed. You go fix yourself, and then I'll come in, because then we've got something to work with. And so that's a trap, obviously, because all the person at home has to do is say, no, you're not there yet, you're not there yet. So that's not a good sign.
Right, and let's assume that that person knows, because that is important to mention. Now let's say that I realize, like, look, I know I don't have a problem. I'm not a perfect man. I'm not a perfect woman. But the problem does not lie with me. Let's assume that person has enough self-esteem and self-confidence to realize it's like, no, it's either you or both of us together, but I'm not going to go to counseling, or if I do, it's only as a way of luring you, the cluster B person, in. But I'm not even going to ask how you do that. Let's just assume that I have finally gotten cluster B to come to therapy alone or with me. Take it from there. And before we go any further, I've forgotten to mention, you are a licensed clinical social worker. So you actually do meet with these types of personalities. All right.
Yeah.
So I finally got cluster B to come in, whether it's at the point of a gun or whatever. No, not literally, folks, but that person is now meeting with you. You can tell me either about in a couple situation or one-on-one, whichever you want to start.
It really helps if you're in a relationship with a cluster B. It really helps if you can get the person in so that the therapist can watch the dynamic and say, oh, here's what's going on, this is cluster B type stuff, which is much different than if just the cluster B comes in. That person will describe him or herself to a T, but say, that's my spouse. So I'm sitting there thinking, wow, what a horrible person. And then they come in together and I watch them and go, oh, this is a cluster B. You know, I got hoodwinked, because they're really good actors and actresses. I'd like to thank the Academy. I mean, they're just absolutely spectacular. Okay, so what happens is when they come in, usually the cluster B attacks the spouse, and if it's not an overt attack, it's just little digs, but it's always about eroding the other person's credibility. And then the next job is to erode my credibility. I can't remember if I mentioned this last time or not. A couple came in and she finally brought her cluster B boyfriend, and then when I talked to the woman later and I said, how did it go? And she said, well, he told me that your socks didn't match. And I laughed and said, that's perfect. It has nothing to do with anything, but it's a diversion and a way to create chaos. Okay, so then when the so then when the cluster B does come in, okay, so first it's a podium to denigrate the spouse, and then also to use to denigrate me oftentimes, and then it's to learn phrases and dynamics to use against their partner when they go back home. It's never about, let's balance this out so we can have an adult to adult. It's always about domination.
Are all counselors created equal on the subject of cluster B and dealing with cluster B counseling?
No. Here's the tricky thing. First off, the cluster Bs, again, spectacular actors and actresses. It's easy to get sucked in, which is why I want to preferably see both people together, at least one session. And then also, if the counselor doesn't have a lot of background with cluster B, it's easy for them to get sucked in and to be manipulated.
And these are people that are trained? These are people, I mean, so how do they get sucked in? How have you been sucked in times past before you recognized it?
Oh, this was just spectacular. Great eye-opener. I was humiliated. The guy came in, told me this horror story of his wife, And then at some point I said, can you bring your wife in so I can see you guys together? And it was him. She was a total sweetheart, and he was projecting all of his junk onto her. And I was like, oh, okay, that's why I want to see people together, if at all possible.
What do you do to talk? You talk to a counselor, and how do you assess whether this counselor has read an article in Psychology Today as opposed to someone who has some deeper understanding?
Let's see, word of mouth is a good way. I would go in, what I do, for example, is I meet with people before we start therapy, and I meet with them for about 10 or 15 minutes to see if there's a good fit, and then they tell me their situation, I explain, this is what my approach would be, and then I send them home.
Here's another thought, and what was it I was going to ask? Repressed memory syndrome was pretty popular for a while and got debunked. Are there cluster B people that have blind spots and see everything as cluster B and call everybody a cluster B sufferer? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to watch for it. I have to monitor myself because I'm so used to seeing that, and then I have to go, hang on a second, is this really?
Something might seem, it could be perfectly normal behavior, but also the behavior of one suffering with cluster B, and you have to take a totality. Is that what you're telling me?
Right.
So is there anything else we can do to minimize risks? Whether it be in a counseling relationship or just in the relationship generally that we have, if we're bound and determined to be in a relationship with a cluster B personality type.
Yes. Let's see. Actually, I wrote a few things down. Boundary setting. That's really important to set boundaries. This is what I'm willing to do, and this is what I'm not willing to do. A brilliant therapist years ago taught me this. She said, Gary, don't tell people what they're going to do and what they're not going to do, because they don't have to. Tell them what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. Make those decisions when you're calm, not when you're angry or lonely or any really emotions, just when you're nice and calm, and then you have to stick to it. If you set a boundary and you let the other person step over the boundary and you don't follow through with the consequence, then we have just intermittently reinforced that person that will cave. And so they will crank up their energy to get what they want next time and then the time after that.
So it's going to be tiring. It's going to be exhausting.
Yes. It will be exhausting because they're always going to do that. Always. And so you're going to have to be there with a stick between their jaws or run or whatever. It will be exhausting. And
then at some point they will be a little easier to work with because they know the consequence is always there. Would that be?
Maybe. I had this old Ford F-250 truck, and it pulled to the right, and I went and had it the alignment done, and then it pulled to the left, and then I took it back and I said no, and then it pulled to the right, and the guy said the way this is designed, there was some flaw. It's going to pull to the right or the left. Take your pick. He said you can replace the entire thing if you want, if you can find the parts, but you're probably not going to because the truck's so old. So I said, okay, we'll have it pull to the right because that's what I was used to. And that's kind of like the reptiles. They're going to pull right or left. They're never going to go straight. And if they are, it's just take your hands off the wheel and whoop, there we go again.
Can you change a cluster B person?
Again, there are programs out there and all these wonderful testimonials, and I just say hang on to your money and run. Right. I just don't see it. From their point of view, they don't have the problem. You're the one with the problem. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. They'll amp up the energy, anything to get you back down here. And to the cluster Bs, the narcissist, anything less than, oh, you're perfect. They see the world in black and white, all right? 100%, 0%. And if you say, well, you're 99.9% wonderful, that's not 100%. And then, boom, there they go.
Does cluster B mellow with age? I mean, once your sex appeal wears off and your money wears off, and being in a popular crowd, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Are there 80-year-old cluster B people?
Yeah. Okay. So back to the truck again. Down the road, it's still going to pull to the right, but I don't drive as fast as I used to. All right. So it's not going to pull quite as hard. And with cluster Bs, the notion is that they really never get better. It's that as they get older, they don't have the energy to attack all the time, but it's still there underneath the surface.
And is it possible to also, they don't have as many opportunities because you're not talking about finances as much. You're not talking about problems with kids. You're not having a dispute over where to go for dinner or a movie and stuff like that because it's just your life has changed, so to speak.
Well, the kids and the movies and all of that stuff.
What I'm trying to say is, fewer topics of dispute.
Right.
Kind of like when you're saying you're driving slower.
Right. Okay, so it doesn't really matter if there are fewer topics to dispute, because that's not what's going on. That's just talking about the stuff up here to get down to the psychological level where they can manipulate. So even if they only have one topic to dispute, they're going to, because that's what they do.
All right.
And if they've got 1,000 topics, it's just easier, but it's still there always.
We've talked a little bit about, Helen Keller. She was a lost cause, Gary, but yet with patience and love, she learned to understand sign language and even talk, even though she was blind and deaf and dumb. If I just put enough effort into it, surely I can turn someone around. It may take a lot, and it may require a constant vigilance, and that person might have to, like an alcoholic on the wagon, but it can be done, right?
Yeah, I just don't ever see it. Sorry, man. I just don't ever see it.
Why do people allow themselves to be used? So are there certain personality types that cluster Bs are very good at sucking the life out of?
Yeah, nice guys and nice gals, absolutely.
And define what you mean by that.
Well,
I consider myself to be a pretty nice guy. You a nice guy?
I'm a nice guy too.
So are you susceptible to having all the life sucked out of you by a cluster B?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But you have knowledge, and so you're able to.
It's different now,
all
but
right.
before someone. Well, there's that fish, what was it, like a puffer fish or something? It looks like a rock, and it has this antenna that comes up, and a little worm on the end. It's not a worm, but it looks like a worm.
Right.
And so the big fish is sitting there, beautifully camouflaged, and there's this little worm that's going, oh, I'm injured, and another fish comes by and goes, oh, I think I'm going to get that. Well, okay. So it's kind of like that. The cluster Bs oftentimes will go, oh, I need some help, or I just need a place to stay for a couple of days, or something like that. And we're nice guys, and we go, oh, there's a nice mammal. I will help this mammal.
And are they conscious of what they're doing, these cluster B people?
It depends, I think, on how high functioning they are. I think there's a big chunk down here, they're just on autopilot. And the people who are conscious can say, okay, I'm going to do this and this and this. They feel this drive. They're not quite sure why, but they go, okay, I'm going to get money from that person, or I'm going to take her to the cleaners, or whatever. And they might not know why they're doing that. It's just that's what they do.
Do cluster B personality types have any redeeming values?
Oh,
Such
yeah.
as, you've got the autistic or the idiot savant who can play piano beautifully, and then it's just a real pain in the neck all the other times,
Right.
or has to be, or will walk out into traffic. Is there something? Does cluster B sharpen anyone's talents in any areas? Is there something that cluster Bs have to offer the world? I'm not saying that any one person is more valuable than another, but is there something that's like, well, this cluster B is really annoying, but wow, you really got to hand it to his artistic talent, or something like that?
Yeah. It just depends on where you are in a socioeconomic status. For example, if you read the biography on Steve Jobs, textbook cluster B, and he was a genius, a visionary. Most of the people, from my observation, who are in Congress, CEOs, high-level managers, athletes, they have a lot of this cluster B stuff in them. And you have to have that if you're going to get on top and stay on top. I'm right, I'm right, out of my way. Whereas I might say, well, I won the last 3 games, maybe I'll let this person, ahead of me, so they feel good about themselves. Boom, the cluster B, or someone with a higher degree of narcissism is going to consume me. And so yes, they absolutely have a function. It's when they get too much power, that's when they get dangerous. For example, if I had to go into war, I would want my leaders probably being more cluster B, all right, because I might be more afraid of them than the enemy.
Okay.
All right. Also, the reason we're at war is, I guarantee, it's from a cluster B mindset. So I would want them to protect me, but that's how I got there to begin with.
Cluster B may sacrifice a bunch of people to claim that hill, but you
Right.
claimed the hill, which was a step toward winning the war.
Right. That they started.
That they started.
Right.
Okay, I see.
You see what I mean?
All right, so Steve Jobs, bad cluster B or just strong cluster B, but
Well, it depends on which end of the gun barrel you're looking
I have read
at,
his biography.
Yeah. He wouldn't get his...
People have said it was pretty even-handed.
Mm-hmm.
He did not come across to me as a very likable human being
Right.
when it came to being a friend
Mm-hmm.
or family member.
Right. Right.
Would that be your assessment
Yeah,
too?
yeah, absolutely. And he wouldn't get his way, so he'd throw a tantrum and he'd scream and he'd cry and then he'd play victim.
And he did this thing where he called it, what was it? Some kind of science fiction term. Oh, a reality distortion field.
Mm-hmm.
We would actually get people to question
Right.
what they knew to be true. And he was very good at that because people would say, no, Steve,
Mhm.
we cannot afford this. And he
Right.
would just kind of use his Jedi mind tricks, which they called his reality distortion field.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, he built Apple into a great company
Right.
twice.
Right.
He saved it from oblivion.
Right.
Can I live my life with a cluster B personality sufferer, for lack of a better term, and feel like I have a good life, or am I better off? Let me two questions. Am I better off just finding somebody else, or what compromises will I have to make if I'm committed to staying in a relationship? Either because I love those Steve Jobs-like successes,
Mhm.
that I'm willing to overlook it, or saying, well, you see where I'm coming
Right,
from?
right.
What can I do?
Well, that's really the bottom line, is what is it you want from your relationship? If you get two narcissists who are in a relationship, it's called narcissistic mirroring. They oftentimes don't see their own disorders. All right, and so those people can be relatively happy because they're both nuts, but they're nuts in the same way and they don't recognize that they're nuts. The people around them will suffer, but oftentimes not these.
Okay.
All right, so if you have a cluster B, you've got a reptile and a mammal. The mammal is going to have an excessive amount of stress over the course of his or her life, which is significant. All right, it's going to be an uphill battle all the time. You're going to have to set boundaries, and then you have to stick to them. When you stick to them, it may be World War III, and the cluster B is counting on you caving in and not going to World War III and IV and V, but you have to, otherwise you'll be under their thumb again.
This thought just occurred to me. I mean, why aren't cluster Bs poisoning me in my sleep? By the way, I don't. My wife's a wonderful person. I do not think she's cluster B or even close. But let's assume that hypothetically, why doesn't the cluster B personality type poison me?
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't the cluster B type not push me off a cliff at the first opportunity?
Mm-hmm.
Do they have morals?
Yeah, they'll have morals, but their morals are fluid. You know, this is where I draw the line.
So does a cluster B personality type not push me off a cliff out of fear of getting caught,
Well,
as opposed to valuing life?
again, it depends on their level of functioning and how severe they are. So there was the woman not too long ago in the news who pushed her fiance off the cliff, literally.
Right.
Okay. And she had said, because they were on their honeymoon, and she said, oh, I knew we shouldn't have gotten married. I knew we shouldn't have gotten married. Well, there's a man I know who was on his honeymoon. He didn't know she was cluster B at the time, and she started saying that very same thing. I knew I shouldn't have gotten married, and then turned out to be really an unstable person.
Stop for a second.
All right, so sometimes they will push you off the cliff like that woman, or they will poison you in your sleep. Excuse me. But other times, those are people who are very severe. If you dial it back, they're not going to do that because these people are very parasitic, and you're the host. So they don't want to kill their host. They're just going to go have to find another one, which they will anyway eventually.
All right. You familiar then with that movie, Now You See Me, Now You Don't?
The magician?
Yes.
Mhm.
It sounds like what you're saying is these are people they're good illusionists.
Right.
They're good actors.
Right.
Getting you to see something. So you can marry a cluster B type personality person because that person is baiting the hook
Right.
and then setting the hook.
Right.
So somebody that, how do you know you're just not getting up? Like if I'm on my honeymoon and my spouse says, "Oh, I should never have done this,"
Mhm.
or starts behaving in cluster B, and I've watched this podcast, so I'm starting to see the classic signs.
Mhm.
What do I do? Give it a week? Give it a month? Give it a year? What do I do?
Get a therapist and read. There's tons of books written on cluster Bs, and start to look for red flags. And hopefully, people before they get married will do this and look for red flags.
Would it be going too far to say, let's assume that I've gotten married. On my honeymoon, I start to see the signs. 2-3 months in, because I want to be rational about this, and I go, you know what? I think I've just bought a ticket to hell, and then, but I'm also brave enough to say, all right, you know what? I think that we're totally incompatible. Frankly, I don't care what you say. I think I was sold a bill of goods up to this point. I don't want to get divorced, but I also don't want to be married to someone who I think may be a cluster B personality type. I want us to go to 3 therapists, and I want us to be assessed. And if at least two of the three say you're cluster B, I'm gone.
Okay.
Be okay?
It would if you got, assuming the partner would do that, and assuming that the 3 therapists had an extensive background with cluster B. So that would be a great way to do it. Another way to do it would be just check with your own gut. Go, that doesn't feel good. Again, that doesn't feel good again. And when I try to talk to my partner and she or he's getting angry, that's not a good sign at all. And if the other person's not willing to work on it, then it's probably better to get out sooner rather than later.
But I would think, from my own personal experience, not to get too personal, but I mean, every newlywed couple or couple that's decided to cohabit, they do go through a transition period.
Right.
So how do you know it's not just 2 people learning to get along?
What I see is with the cluster Bs, I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. Okay, so you don't see, oh wow, I apologize, I went too far, I shouldn't have said that, I hurt your feelings. It's not like that. It's, well, you're just being sensitive, I told you. And so it's that parent to child, and you see that over and over and over. It's not a good sign.
And you've already been singled out by this cluster B personality type for someone who easily takes the fall and is apologetic,
Right.
which means that you might actually be, and now you're in the reality distortion field going, well, gee, I guess I could have been more understanding. I guess I could have been more punctual. I mean, I was on time, but maybe I should get there 5 minutes early. Or, yeah, I mean, I didn't ask if she enjoys Italian food. And like, just make sure, so check yourself and don't be willing to just accept that as your coping mechanism.
Right. The main thing is check in with your gut, because your gut will tell you this doesn't feel good, there's something wrong here. Even if the therapist doesn't agree, it doesn't matter. Check in with your gut.
All right. Gary, thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to have just another popular podcast because of this, and I've learned a lot. I know that many of you watching this have learned a lot as well.
Okay, thanks.